The late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks through the windows of Westfield Lux, an upscale boutique that catered to the wealthiest residents of Rosemont. The kind of place where soft jazz floated in the air and whispers carried more weight than shouts. The scent of leather and expensive perfume lingered as well-heeled customers browsed, occasionally glancing at their reflections in the mirrored walls. To someone passing by, it was just another quiet day for Westfield Lux. To Elias Bennett, it was a test of patience he hadn't expected. Elias adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit as he browsed the display of watches. Standing at 6'3", with broad shoulders and an air of quiet authority, he exuded power. Yet his expression, always calm and reserved, made him approachable, almost unassuming. If anyone looked closely, they'd notice his hands, large and strong, but softened by years of precise work. They were the hands of a world-renowned surgeon. Despite his success, Elias didn't care for ostentation. He valued simplicity. Most of his clothing was understated, save for the watch he wore every day, a gift from his late father. Still, he had a weakness for timepieces, and after a grueling week of back-to-back surgeries, he decided to indulge. "Is there anything I can help you with, sir?" Elias turned to find a store associate approaching him. The man's name tag read Trevor, and his smile seemed polite enough, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking for now," Elias replied smoothly, returning his attention to a sleek silver watch on display. Trevor didn't move. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Elias glanced up, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Pardon?" Trevor's smile faltered slightly. "I mean, these are the higher-end collections." Elias straightened, his gaze locking onto Trevor's. "I'm well aware." The young man took a step back, his discomfort masked poorly by a forced chuckle. "Of course. Let me know if you need any assistance." Elias watched him retreat, a familiar weight settling in his chest. He'd dealt with subtle microaggressions like this before, but something about Trevor's tone gnawed at him. He shook it off, his gaze returning to the watch collection. Not today, he told himself. He wouldn't let ignorance ruin his mood. But as he reached out to examine a gold timepiece, a voice from the corner of the room pierced the soft jazz playing overhead. "Excuse me, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from that display." Elias turned, surprised, to find Trevor returning with a taller, older man who was clearly a manager. His name tag read Richard. The manager's face was blank, almost cold, but Elias noticed how his eyes flickered with suspicion as they darted to Elias' hand hovering near the watch. Elias' jaw tightened slightly. "Is there a problem?" Richard clasped his hands together, his tone cool and professional. "One of our associates mentioned you've been lingering around the watches for quite some time. Would you mind telling me why?" Elias' expression remained calm, though his patience thinned. "I don't see how that's any of your business." Trevor stepped in eagerly. "It's just that these displays contain very high-value items, and we've had issues in the past." The implication hit Elias like a slap. He straightened his posture, his voice low but commanding. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Not at all," Richard said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We simply want to ensure our merchandise is safe." Elias exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. He knew what was happening here. He'd seen it countless times. A black man in a luxury store? Suspicion always followed. "I'm a paying customer, just like anyone else here," Elias said firmly. "And unless you have proof that I've done something wrong, I'd appreciate being left alone." Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Richard, however, wasn't ready to back down. "I'll need to see some identification, sir." Elias froze. The request was absurd, humiliating even. Around them, other customers were beginning to take notice, their curious glances piercing like needles. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice calm but icy. Richard didn't blink. "We just need to confirm that you're here for legitimate reasons. Store policy." Elias stared at him for a long moment. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the quiet whispers, the subtle gasps. He was no stranger to this treatment, but this time felt different, because he knew he hadn't done a single thing to warrant it. "I'm not showing you my ID," Elias said finally, "and you're making a serious mistake." Richard's jaw tightened, and Trevor took a small step forward, emboldened by the manager's stance. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to contact security." The room seemed to freeze. Elias' fists clenched at his sides, though his expression remained impassive. He had two choices: comply and humiliate himself further, or refuse and escalate the situation. Before he could answer, a voice cut through the growing tension. "Is there a problem here?" Elias turned to see a woman approaching. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her heels clicking against the marble floor with each step. Her auburn hair framed her face, and her expression was one of authority. "Who are you?" Richard asked, clearly thrown off by her presence. The woman stopped beside Elias, her gaze hard. "I'm Marissa Langley, senior partner at Langley & Associates." She turned to Elias, offering a small smile. "Dr. Bennett, is everything all right?" Elias blinked, momentarily surprised. He recognized her name. Marissa was one of the city's top attorneys, a woman whose reputation carried weight in the wealthiest circles. He nodded slightly. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Marissa's eyes flicked to Richard, then Trevor. Her smile turned razor-sharp. "Misunderstanding? From where I'm standing, it looks like blatant discrimination." Richard paled. I can assure you." Marissa raised a hand, silencing him. "Dr. Bennett doesn't need to explain himself to you. And unless you want a lawsuit that drags this store's name through the mud, I suggest you apologize." Immediately, the room held its breath. Trevor's face was white as a sheet. Richard stammered, his voice shaky. I'm sorry, sir. It was a mistake." Elias didn't respond. He simply met Richard's gaze, unblinking, until the manager looked away. Marissa turned back to Elias, her voice soft. "Shall we go?" Elias nodded, following her toward the exit. The whispers followed them, but Elias held his head high, refusing to let the moment define him. As they stepped outside, Marissa glanced at him. "Are you okay?" Elias nodded slowly. "I will be." Her smile was small but knowing. "Good. Because people like that don't deserve to take your dignity." Elias exhaled, the weight on his chest easing slightly. But he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint sizzle of bacon on the griddle as the morning rush buzzed through Gertie's diner. The place wasn't much to look at: faded linoleum floors, vinyl booze cracked from years of wear, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in a decade. But it was a local staple. The kind of place where the regulars never needed to see a menu, and Gertie herself would yell your order back to the kitchen the moment you walked through the door. It was comfortable, unassuming. It was exactly why Micah Thompson liked it. Micah sat in the far corner booth, nursing his second cup of coffee, dressed in a simple black sweater and jeans. He was a man who carried himself with quiet confidence, broad-shouldered, well over 6 feet, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. A short beard peppered with gray gave him the distinguished look of someone older than his 44 years, and yet his demeanor made him feel entirely approachable. To the other patrons at Gertie's, Micah was just another face. Just another man having his breakfast and minding his business. And that was fine by him. Micah enjoyed moments like this, where no one cared who he was or what he did. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, miles away from glass-walled offices, board meetings, and the constant noise of corporate life, he could breathe. He glanced out the window. The sun had just begun its ascent, casting a soft golden glow over the sleepy town of Hayworth. Micah had come here on business, and offered to buy out a struggling logistics company, something that should have been routine. He'd grown accustomed to small-town skepticism, to closed doors and cautious stares when he introduced himself as the CEO of Thompson Global Ventures. But this morning, he wasn't here to sign papers or make deals. He just wanted a stack of pancakes and some peace. Gertie herself shuffled over with a fresh pot of coffee, her apron dusted with flour, and her hair pinned in an untidy bun. She was a stout woman in her 60s with a voice as warm as the food she served. "More coffee, hon?" "Yes, please," Micah said, offering her a polite smile as she refilled his mug. "Don't see many new faces around here," she said conversationally. "You passing through?" "Something like that," Micah replied. Just here for work. Well, welcome to Hayworth. It ain't much, but it's home, she said with pride before shuffling off to another table. Micah took a sip of the fresh coffee and leaned back in his booth, allowing himself to relax. That relaxation didn't last long. The sound of the diner door creaking open caught his attention. Micah looked up just in time to see two men step inside, both dressed in dusty work clothes and worn baseball caps. The taller of the two was thickly built, with a hard face and narrowed eyes that swept over the room as though he owned it. His companion was leaner, but carried the same air of unchecked arrogance. The taller man's gaze landed on Micah almost instantly, and Micah felt the shift in the room like a subtle change in air pressure. "Place is packed, Rob," the leaner man muttered, scanning the booths. The tall one, Rob, grunted in response, his eyes lingering on Micah's table. The diner wasn't packed, but the far corner booth, apparently, was the only one worth having. Micah didn't react. Years of sitting in boardrooms, surrounded by men who underestimated him, had taught him the value of stillness. He kept his focus on his coffee, waiting. Sure enough, Rob approached the table, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. He stopped at the edge of the booth, casting a shadow over Micah's pancakes. "You're in my seat." Micah looked up slowly, meeting Rob's stare. His expression remained calm, unreadable. "I didn't see your name on it." The leaner man snorted, as if that were the funniest thing he'd heard all morning. Rob's mouth pulled into something that might have been a smile, if not for the hostility behind it. "You're real funny," Rob said, his tone as flat as his expression. "But I'm not joking. That's my booth. Always has been." Micah set his coffee down carefully. "It's just a booth. There are plenty of other seats." Rob leaned closer, bracing a hand on the table. "I don't think you understand. You're not from around here, so let me spell it out for you. We don't like strangers taking up space that isn't theirs." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. The tension didn't go unnoticed by the other patrons. A few heads turned in Micah's direction, their faces unreadable. Conversations dimmed to murmurs. Gertie appeared from behind the counter, her voice sharp. "Rob, leave the man alone. Ain't nobody here owes you anything." Rob ignored her, his gaze never leaving Micah. The challenge in his posture was clear, and Micah had seen it before, on men who thought power was something you wore like a badge, something you wielded like a weapon. Micah considered his options. He could move. It wasn't worth the trouble. Or he could stand his ground, something he'd been forced to do his entire life. "Do we have a problem?" Micah asked evenly, his voice calm but firm. Rob blinked, clearly thrown by the question. He had expected resistance, but not this quiet confidence. Micah's stillness seemed to unnerve him. The leaner man, standing just behind Rob, scoffed. "Man, we're just trying to help you out. Don't want no trouble." Micah's eyes didn't waver. "Funny, you look like the ones trying to start it." Rob's jaw tightened. Micah could see the gears turning in his head, the way his fists twitched at his sides as if daring Micah to give him an excuse. "Sit somewhere else," Rob growled finally. "And if I don't?" Micah replied, his voice like tempered steel. The air in the diner crackled. For a split second, Micah thought Rob might actually take a swing. He could see it in the man's posture, in the way he shifted his weight. But before Rob could decide, Gertie's voice rang out like a whip. "Rob Jenkins, if you don't leave this man alone, you'll be taking your breakfast in the parking lot. I'm not playing with you." Rob froze, caught between his pride and Gertie's wrath. After a long moment, he stepped back, his sneer barely contained. "Suit yourself," he spat. "But don't think for a second you belong here." Micah didn't flinch. He held Rob's stare until the man turned and stomped out of the diner, his friend trailing behind him. The bell above the door jingled faintly, and the tension in the room began to dissipate. Gertie walked over, shaking her head as she poured Micah a fresh cup of coffee. "I'm real sorry about that, hon. Rob thinks he owns this town just because his daddy's been here longer than the weeds." Micah smiled faintly, grateful for her kindness. "It's not your fault." She sighed, placing a hand on her hip. "Some people don't know how to act when they see a man they can't put in a box. You need anything else?" Micah shook his head. "No, thank you." As Gertie walked away, Micah stared out the window, his thoughts lingering on Rob's parting words. Don't think for a second you belong here. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words. It wouldn't be the last. But Micah wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Micah watched the dust settle through the diner's window as Rob and his friend climbed into an old pickup truck, its rusted engine growling to life. The truck peeled out of the gravel lot, spitting rocks in its wake. He'd seen men like Rob before, men who mistook familiarity with ownership, who measured their worth in power they could only hold over others. He exhaled slowly, willing the tension in his shoulders to ease. Around him, the murmur of conversations returned, though now quieter. It was as if the room hadn't decided yet whether to move on or keep watching him. Some of the customers, regulars who knew Rob's reputation, offered him furtive glances, while others stared into their coffee cups as though nothing had happened. Gertie bustled behind the counter, throwing a rag over her shoulder as she filled plates. "Don't let it bother you, hon," she said softly when she caught his eye. "Rob's bark is worse than his bite." Micah offered her a faint smile. "I've heard that before." She didn't argue. Instead, she gave a small nod and returned to her work. But Micah knew better. People like Rob often had more than bark. They had friends, influence, and a whole world that quietly bent to their arrogance because it was easier than pushing back. Micah returned to his pancakes, though the appetite he'd come in with had faded. He'd dealt with men like Rob his entire life, from college campuses where his intelligence was second-guessed, to boardrooms where his ideas had to shout to be heard over lesser ones. Each encounter left a mark, a scar he carried with him. The last bite of pancake felt heavier than it should have as he set his fork down. He left a generous tip on the table, more than Gertie would expect, and rose to leave. The quiet murmurs of the diner followed him as he stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Micah paused on the gravel lot, breathing it in. For a moment, he felt the familiar urge to let it roll off his back, to shrug the morning off like he always did. But something about this time felt different. "It's just a booth." That thought rattled in his head, taunting him. But it wasn't just a booth. It was everything Rob represented. Micah's car, a black Audi SUV, was parked near the edge of the lot. As he approached, he noticed the faint glint of something near the front tire. His stride slowed, instincts kicking in. From years in high-stakes corporate life, Micah knew how to trust his gut. He crouched down. The glass caught the sun's reflection, shattered pieces scattered across the ground beneath the tire. And just like that, his unease found a target. Micah rose to his full height, scanning the lot. The truck Rob had driven was gone, but the vandalism felt obvious. It wasn't the work of an accident. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Good morning, Sheriff's Department," said the dispatcher on the other end when the call connected. "Yes, this is Micah Thompson," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm at Gertie's diner. Someone's vandalized my car, shattered glass near my front tire. I'd like to report it." "Sure thing, sir. We'll send someone out." "Thank you," Micah said, ending the call. He leaned back against his car, arms crossed, waiting. Inside, Gertie had noticed. She peered out through the window, her face lined with concern. She didn't come outside. Micah appreciated that. The last thing he needed was for anyone else to get tangled in this. The sheriff's car pulled into the lot 15 minutes later, kicking up dust as it approached. Micah straightened as the vehicle came to a stop, his calm demeanor firmly in place. Two officers stepped out. One a stocky man in his 40s, his uniform straining at the seams, and the other a younger deputy with nervous energy. The older officer adjusted his belt as he approached. "Morning. You the one who called?" "I am," Micah replied. "Micah Thompson." He extended his hand, but the officer ignored it, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. "Sheriff Tillman," the man said curtly. "What's the issue here?" Micah gestured toward the ground near his car. "Someone left broken glass under my tire. I didn't see it when I parked, but it looks deliberate." The sheriff didn't glance at the evidence right away. Instead, his eyes swept over Micah's car, taking in the luxury vehicle. Then his gaze settled on Micah himself, sizing him up as if weighing his presence. "You say someone left it there?" "That's right," Micah said evenly. "It wasn't there when I arrived. Tillman scribbled something down. And you didn't see anyone do it?" "No." "You got any enemies here, Mr. Thompson?" Micah blinked, caught off guard by the question. I don't even live here. I'm here on business. Tillman shrugged. Funny how things happen to outsiders. You know what I mean? Micah's patience thinned. Sheriff, are you going to investigate this or not? Tillman's expression shifted, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. We'll take a look at it. Broken glass, though, that's not exactly a felony. That's not the point, Micah said, his voice steady but sharp. This was deliberate. If I hadn't seen it, it could have caused serious damage to my vehicle. And maybe it wasn't deliberate, Tillman countered. A lot of glass around here. Bottles break. Cars drive over them. Accidents happen. Micah inhaled slowly, working to keep his anger at bay. The sheriff wasn't here to help. That much was clear. His dismissive tone, the way he refused to acknowledge Micah's concerns. These weren't accidental. The younger deputy finally spoke up, his voice unsure. We could check the diner's security cameras. Maybe they caught something. Micah looked at the deputy, grateful for the sliver of logic. But Tillman shook his head, shooting the deputy a sharp glance. You think Gertie's got high-end surveillance? It's a diner, Sam. Sam looked away, cowed. Micah felt the frustration rising in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Years of being the only black man in a room full of powerful executives had taught him how to measure his reactions. He could read Tillman like an open book. The sheriff didn't like outsiders, and he especially didn't like him. This isn't just about broken glass, Micah said quietly, locking eyes with the sheriff. You and I both know it. Tillman's smirk faded, replaced by something harder. I'll file the report, Mr. Thompson, but don't expect much to come of it. He turned on his heel and walked back to the squad car, leaving Micah standing there, fists clenched at his sides. The deputy hesitated, offering Micah an apologetic glance before following the sheriff. Micah watched the patrol car pull away, the engine kicking up more dust as it left the lot. He looked down at the broken glass, the shards glinting like accusations in the morning light. Back inside the diner, Gertie waited with a cup of coffee and a sympathetic expression. I saw what happened, she said softly as Micah sat back down in his booth. It's nothing new, he replied, though the tightness in his chest told him otherwise. I'm sorry, Han, she said, her voice genuine. This town's got some good folks, but there are plenty like Rob and Sheriff Tillman who think they run the place. Micah nodded, swirling the coffee in his cup. He didn't say it out loud, but he'd heard versions of this before. Good folks always seemed to coexist alongside those who did harm, and the former rarely spoke up. Do you think Rob did it? Gertie asked quietly. Micah looked at her. Who else? She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. Well, I wouldn't leave your car out there for long. Rob's the kind who doesn't take well to being embarrassed. Micah offered her a small smile. I'll keep that in mind. But as he sat there, sipping the coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that Gertie was right. Rob wasn't done, and this was only the beginning. The rest of the day unfolded in a fog. Micah finished his meeting with the logistics company. Professional, polished, yet far from present. His mind was elsewhere. By the time he pulled back into his hotel parking lot, the weight of the morning still lingered, pressing at the edge of his patience. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head. Rob's sneer, Sheriff Tillman's dismissal, the deliberate glass under his tire. Each memory sharpened the edges of his anger. He had spent a lifetime being underestimated, his competence questioned, his very presence scrutinized as though he didn't belong. Always the same story, he thought. Micah had learned long ago how to play the game. Stay calm, stay quiet, and keep moving. Prove yourself through your work. But the events of the morning unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. That night, as he sat at the desk in his hotel room, reviewing contracts on his laptop, the knock at the door startled him. Who would be here at this hour? Micah frowned and stood, cautiously peering through the peephole. Outside stood two uniformed officers. His chest tightened. He opened the door slowly. Mr. Thompson? One of them asked. This officer was young, blonde, and carried the same hardened edge Micah had seen in Rob. The name tag on his chest read Deputy S. Daniels. Beside him stood an older officer with gray at his temples, though his expression looked no kinder. Yes, Micah replied evenly. We're here about a report of stolen property, Daniels said, his tone clipped. Micah blinked. I'm sorry, what? Daniels pulled out a small notebook, feigning professionalism. A witness claims you were involved in a theft earlier today at Gertie's Diner. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Micah's pulse quickened, though his face betrayed nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, Daniels said, smirking slightly. You'll have a chance to explain that at the station. Micah's jaw clenched as he processed the absurdity of what he was hearing. You're arresting me? Based on what evidence? The older officer spoke up, his voice gravelly and dismissive. Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Don't make it difficult. Micah took a step back, his heart pounding, but his voice remained firm. I want to know the charge. Suspicion of theft, Daniels said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Step outside and turn around. This is ridiculous, Micah shot back, his voice rising. I haven't stolen anything. Daniels' smirk widened. We'll see about that. Micah's fists clenched at his sides. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to argue, to resist the blatant injustice of it. But he knew how this would look. A black man resisting arrest. He could already see how it would play out in their narrative. With a deep breath, he stepped outside. I'll cooperate. But this is a mistake. Daniels roughly grabbed Micah's arm, twisting it behind his back as he snapped the cold handcuffs around his wrists. You're making the right choice, Daniels muttered smugly. Micah sat silently in the back of the squad car as they drove through the dimly lit streets of Hayworth. The weight of the cuffs around his wrists felt heavier than they should have, each metal click a reminder of what this was, a power play, a humiliation, suspicion of theft. The absurdity burned in his chest. This wasn't about stolen property. This was about control. The car slowed as they approached the sheriff's department, a squat brick building with flickering lights illuminating the parking lot. Micah spotted Sheriff Tillman standing by the entrance, arms crossed, an expression smug. As Daniels pulled him from the car, Micah locked eyes with Tillman. This is harassment, Sheriff. You know it. Tillman didn't flinch. Welcome to Hayworth, Mr. Thompson. The words sent a chill through him. They weren't just arresting him. They were making an example of him. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Micah was led to a small, cramped booking area. Deputy Daniels shoved him toward a chair. Sit down. Micah sat, his posture upright, refusing to let them see him rattled. As Daniels uncuffed him, another officer, Deputy Collins, a wiry man with thinning hair, stepped in with a clipboard. We'll need to process you. Standard procedure, Collins said, not meeting Micah's gaze. Micah exhaled, steadying himself. I'd like to make a call. Now! Daniels snorted. You'll get your call when we say so. Micah shot him a sharp glare, but said nothing. He knew better than to escalate. Collins hesitated, glancing between Micah and Daniels. Let's just get this done, all right? Micah stood, enduring the indignity of being fingerprinted like a common criminal. He kept his gaze fixed forward, forcing himself to focus on what mattered, getting out of this and clearing his name. But when Collins reached for the camera, Micah's patience cracked. A mug shot? For what? Suspicion of theft? Daniel smirked. Like I said, standard procedure. Micah stepped back. This is a violation of my rights. Daniel's smirk vanished, replaced with cold hostility. He stepped forward, invading Micah's space. You think you're better than us, don't you? Coming into our town, acting like you own the place. You don't. Micah didn't blink. This isn't your town, deputy. It belongs to everyone who lives here. And I don't belong to you. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a second, Micah thought he might swing. Instead, the young deputy spat. Take the picture, Collins. The camera flash exploded like a gunshot. Micah stood still, his expression calm, but his blood boiling beneath the surface. They led him to a holding cell, cold steel bars and concrete walls. The clang of the door locking behind him echoed through the room, heavy and final. He sat on the metal bench, staring at the floor. For the first time in years, Micah felt helpless. Not because he couldn't handle the situation, but because it was so painfully predictable. They think this is enough to break me. But Micah Thompson didn't break. His thoughts turned to strategy. There had to be a way to expose this, to force the truth into the light. Someone in this department would listen. And when they did, Rob, Daniels, and Tillman would have to answer for every lie they'd spun. "Hey!" Micah looked up. Collins stood outside the cell, his face pale. He glanced over his shoulder nervously, as though afraid someone might catch him. "What do you want?" Micah asked quietly. Collins hesitated. "This isn't right." Micah stared at him. "Then fix it." Collins shook his head, his voice low. "I can't." "But I heard Tillman and Daniels talking. They planted something at Gertie's, some bracelet. Said it would be easy to pin on you." The word sent a cold shock through Micah's body. "You're telling me they fabricated evidence?" Collins' face tightened. "I didn't say that." He paused. "Look, I'm trying to help you. I'll talk to someone higher up. Maybe someone will listen." Micah nodded, his voice calm but firm. "You do that, and you tell whoever you speak to that Micah Thompson isn't going to let this go." Collins swallowed hard, stepping away. "Sit tight." Micah leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. The stakes had just risen. If what Collins said was true, then they were willing to do more than humiliate him. They were trying to destroy him. But Micah wasn't finished yet. He stood, gripping the bars of the cell and looking toward the hallway. "You started this fight," he thought, "but I'm going to end it." The quiet of the holding cell weighed on Micah like a lead blanket. Every tick of the clock a mocking reminder of his captivity. The stale air smelled faintly of bleach, and the flickering fluorescent light overhead hummed like a hornet trapped in a jar. Micah paced the small, concrete room, his mind a whirlwind. The words of Deputy Collins echoed in his head. They planted something. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was an orchestrated attempt to ruin him, to paint him as a criminal in a town where his word would always mean less than theirs. What's the endgame here? Micah stopped pacing and sat on the edge of the metal bench. His pulse slowed as clarity settled over him. This was a test, a game of power designed to see if he'd crumble under the pressure, if he'd lash out and give them an excuse to bury him deeper. Not a chance. If they thought Micah Thompson would let himself be taken down so easily, they'd chosen the wrong man to mess with. The faint sound of approaching footsteps broke through his thoughts. Heavy boots clattered against the linoleum floor. A shadow passed over the cell door's narrow window before it swung open, revealing Sheriff Tillman. "Well," Tillman said, stepping into the room with a smug smile. "You've had some time to think, Mr. Thompson." Micah didn't bother standing. "I've been thinking, all right." Tillman tilted his head, clearly enjoying the imbalance of power. "We got a witness. Says you were seen near Gertie's with that bracelet. You planning on confessing? Or do you want to drag this out?" Micah's expression didn't waver. "A witness you and your deputies conveniently dug up after I called to report vandalism. You're framing me, and you know it." Tillman chuckled, crossing his arms. "Framing you? That's a strong accusation, Mr. Thompson. A little paranoid, don't you think?" "You're sloppy, Sheriff," Micah said calmly, standing now to meet Tillman's gaze. "Deputy Collins already told me what you're up to. You planted evidence." The sheriff's smugness faltered for half a second, his jaw tightening before the mask returned. "Collins? He doesn't know what he's talking about." "He knows enough," Micah shot back. "And once I'm out of here, I'll make sure everyone knows, too. You won't get away with this." Tillman's smile vanished entirely, replaced with cold hostility. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think your money and your fancy title mean something here? This is my town, Thompson. People here don't give a damn who you are or what you've done. You'll always be an outsider, and nobody's going to believe a word you say." Micah stared him down, refusing to blink. "We'll see about that." Tillman held the stare for a moment longer before stepping back. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Thompson. It might last longer than you think." With that, he turned and left, the door slamming shut behind him. Micah sat back down, his fists clenched at his sides. He wouldn't give in to Tillman's threats, but the sheriff was right about one thing. They'd stacked the deck against him. In a town like Hayworth, where loyalty ran deeper than truth, Micah's word alone wouldn't be enough. "I need proof." Hours passed. The hum of the lights had become a dull drone in the background, but Micah's mind stayed sharp, combing through every detail. Collins was the weak link in Tillman's operation. If Micah could get to him, maybe, just maybe, he'd be able to turn the tide. The sound of footsteps returned, and Micah's heart quickened. This time, it wasn't Tillman. It was Collins, his expression pale and nervous as he glanced around before slipping into the holding area. "Deputy Collins," Micah said evenly. "You've come back." Collins hesitated, as if weighing his decision. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice low. "I've been working under Tillman for years, but this is too far." Micah stood, his voice steady but urgent. "Then do the right thing. Help me get out of here. Tell the truth about what Tillman and Daniels are doing." Collins shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not that simple. Tillman runs this department like a fortress. If I step out of line—" "I get it," Micah said, softening his tone. "But you have a choice. You can keep letting them do this, or you can put a stop to it. You know what they're doing is wrong." Collins' eyes flicked to the door, his nerves clearly fraying. He sighed, shaking his head. "I'll see what I can do. Just hang tight." Before Micah could respond, Collins turned and hurried out of the room, leaving Micah alone once again. But this time, hope flickered at the edges of his frustration. Back at the sheriff's station front desk, Deputy Collins found himself face to face with Daniels, whose smirk made Collins' skin crawl. "What are you doing back there, Collins?" Daniels asked, narrowing his eyes. "Just checking on the suspect," Collins replied, keeping his tone neutral. Daniels chuckled darkly. "Don't waste your time. Sheriff says we'll be shipping him off first thing in the morning. Looks like Mr. Big Shot is finally getting what's coming to him." Collins' stomach turned. "Is it really worth all this?" he asked quietly. Daniels' smirk vanished. "What are you saying, Collins?" "Nothing," Collins muttered, turning away. But as he walked back to his desk, he knew he couldn't pretend much longer. The hours dragged into the late evening when, finally, the sound of the cell door unlocking jolted Micah from his thoughts. He looked up to see Collins again, this time holding a clipboard and a set of keys. "Get up," Collins said, his voice low but firm. Micah frowned, uncertain. "What's happening?" "I'm getting you out of here," Collins whispered. "But we have to move fast." Micah didn't need to be told twice. He stood as Collins unlocked the cuffs and gestured for him to follow. They moved quickly and quietly through the dimly lit hallway, Collins glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I don't know how long I can cover for this," he muttered. "Tillman's out for blood, and if he finds out I helped you—" Micah stopped him with a steady hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing." Collins swallowed hard and nodded. "Let's go." Minutes later, Micah stood in the dark parking lot outside the sheriff's station, the cool night air washing over him like a shock to the system. Collins handed him his keys and looked him dead in the eye. "Get out of here," Collins said. "And if you're smart, you won't come back." Micah shook his head. "I can't do that." Collins' expression faltered. "Are you crazy? Tillman will hunt you down." Micah's voice was calm but unyielding. "I won't let him win. Not like this." Before Collins could argue, Micah climbed into his car. He gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. The sheriff's department was corrupt to its core, but Collins had given him an opening. Micah knew exactly where he had to go next. As Micah's car disappeared into the night, Collins stood in the lot, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the door to the station slammed open, and Sheriff Tillman stepped outside, his face twisted with fury. "Where the hell is he?" Tillman growled. Collins swallowed, knowing that the storm was coming. Micah's hands gripped the steering wheel as his car tore down the dark Tulane road, the headlights cutting through the night. The weight of what he had to do pressed against his chest like an anvil. Running wasn't an option. It never was. His fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every time someone like Sheriff Tillman had used power as a weapon. Every time someone like Micah had been silenced by the weight of their skin and the assumptions made about it. The plan was simple, but dangerous. He couldn't expose Tillman and his deputies without irrefutable proof, but getting it meant walking straight into the lion's den. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Micah picked it up with one hand and glanced at the screen. "Marcus, where are you?" Marcus' voice crackled through the speaker. "Urgent." "I'm heading back to the station," Micah said flatly. There was a pause before Marcus swore under his breath. "Have you lost your mind? Tillman's probably got half his guys looking for you." "Good," Micah replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fire that Marcus recognized immediately. "Let them come. I'm not letting him bury this." "Micah," Marcus said, more softly this time, "they're dangerous. I'm telling you, these men don't play fair." "I know," Micah said simply. "That's why I'm going back." The line went silent for a moment before Marcus sighed. "I'll be there as soon as I can." Micah ended the call and dropped the phone onto the seat. In the distance, the faint glow of Hayworth Sheriff Station came into view, its front windows illuminated like beacons. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his mind was clear. He would confront Tillman, and this time, he'd make sure there were no shadows to hide in. The station parking lot was quiet when Micah pulled in, but something about the stillness felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. He parked his car near the far end, leaving the engine running. Then he stepped out, the night air biting against his skin, and walked toward the entrance with deliberate purpose. The fluorescent lights in the lobby buzzed overhead as Micah stepped inside. Deputy Daniels was the first to notice him. He was leaning casually against the front desk, his face half hidden behind a smirk, but his expression faltered when he saw Micah. Well, Daniels said, straightening up. "Didn't expect to see you back here." Micah didn't stop. He walked straight toward him, his gaze locked, his voice cool and steady. "Where's Tillman?" Daniels laughed under his breath, but there was a nervous edge to it. "You've got some nerve showing up here, Thompson. You really want to go another round?" "I asked you where he is," Micah repeated, his tone sharpening. Before Daniels could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway. Sheriff Tillman emerged, his face darkening the moment he saw Micah standing there. "Well, look who decided to come crawling back," Tillman said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Didn't I tell you this would end badly for you?" Micah's jaw clenched, but he kept his composure. "I'm here to end this, Sheriff. I know what you did." Tillman tilted his head, feigning confusion. "What I did? You planted that bracelet," Micah said, stepping closer. "You and your deputies set this whole thing up because you couldn't stand the sight of me here. Someone who didn't fit into your narrow, bigoted idea of who belongs in your town." Tillman's smirk flickered into something uglier, more dangerous. "Careful, Thompson. You're starting to sound like you're accusing me of something." "I'm not accusing," Micah shot back. "I'm stating a fact." Daniels shifted nervously as the room grew heavier. Behind the front desk, another deputy, a younger woman, stared, her expression caught between uncertainty and curiosity. "You don't have any proof," Tillman said, though there was a slight tremor in his voice now. "I don't need proof to know what you are," Micah replied. "But I will get it." Tillman's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Micah thought the man might lunge at him right there. Instead, the sheriff turned to Daniels. "Take him into the back." Daniels hesitated. "Sheriff." "Do it," Tillman barked. Daniels grabbed Micah's arm, but Micah jerked free, stepping back. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You lay another hand on me, and this whole town will know about it." Tillman laughed darkly. "What, you think anyone's going to believe you? You're just some big-shot outsider. I've got this town in my pocket. You're alone, Thompson. You sure about that?" The voice cut through the tension like a whip. All heads turned toward the door, where Marcus stood, his hands tucked in his coat pockets and a calm but hard look on his face. "What the hell is this?" Tillman snarled. Marcus stepped forward. "Name's Marcus Allen, civil rights attorney. Mr. Thompson called me earlier tonight." He glanced at Micah, his expression tight. "Guess I got here just in time." Tillman's face paled slightly, but he quickly covered it with another sneer. "Attorney or not, he's still got nothing." "Actually," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone, "we've got plenty. Starting with the fact that your deputy here," he gestured to Daniels, "was dumb enough to talk about the planted evidence near a witness." Daniels' face blanched. "What? I didn't." "Yeah, you did," Marcus said sharply. "And you're on record. I've got a statement ready to go to the state police and the press." Tillman's composure cracked. He rounded on Daniels, his voice low and furious. "You idiot! I didn't say anything." Daniels stammered, backing up a step. Micah seized the moment. "It's over, Sheriff. You've spent years bullying people into silence, but not this time. You've gone too far." Tillman's fists clenched, his face turning red. You think you can walk in here and take me down? You have no idea who you're messing with. Neither do you. Micah shot back, his voice rising. I've spent my entire life fighting people like you. You think you're invincible because you've got a badge in a town that's afraid of you. But men like you always lose in the end. The truth catches up to you. Tillman lunged then, his face twisted with rage, but before he could reach Micah, Marcus stepped between them. Back off, Sheriff, Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. You lay a hand on him, and I'll make sure you don't see daylight for the next 10 years. Tillman froze, breathing heavily, his hands trembling with the effort to restrain himself. Micah stepped forward, his voice quiet but filled with unshakable resolve. This ends tonight. Either you admit what you did, or I'll make sure the world finds out. The room was silent, the tension suffocating. Daniels looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, while the younger deputy behind the desk stared at Tillman with something close to fear. Tillman glanced around, realizing that the walls were closing in on him. His grip on power, the very thing he'd spent years maintaining, was slipping through his fingers. You'll regret this, he hissed. No, Micah said, holding his gaze. You will. Tillman's face contorted with fury, but he said nothing. The sheriff turned on his heel and stormed toward the back of the station, leaving the room in stunned silence. Micah exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as Marcus clapped a hand on his back. You okay? Marcus asked quietly. Micah nodded, though his heart still thundered in his chest. It's not over yet, but it's a start. As the two men turned toward the door, Micah caught the younger deputy watching him, her face thoughtful. She gave him a small nod, silent, but full of understanding. Maybe things were starting to change. The sheriff's station was bathed in a sterile, unforgiving light as Micah walked back inside. Every footstep echoed in the silent room, reverberating off the concrete floors as if the building itself were holding its breath. This time he wasn't afraid. This time he wasn't backing down. At the front desk, Daniels froze mid-conversation, his smirk vanishing the moment he saw Micah standing in the doorway. The younger deputy behind the desk glanced between them nervously, sensing the incoming storm. What are you doing back here? Daniels demanded, straightening. His hand hovered near his belt, an unsubtle threat. Micah ignored him. Where's Tillman? His voice carried across the room like a gunshot, cutting through the tension. Daniels' lip curled. You don't call the shots around here, boy. You're lucky you're even walking free after what you pulled. Micah took a step forward, calm and unshakable. Tillman, now! Daniels blinked, thrown off by Micah's composure. Before he could respond, the sheriff himself stepped out of his office, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Sheriff Tillman filled the doorway, his broad frame shadowing the room as his steely gaze locked onto Micah. Well, look who couldn't stay away, Tillman said, his tone dripping with smugness. I thought you'd be halfway out of town by now. I don't run, Micah replied, holding his ground. Tillman smirked, but the glint in his eyes betrayed something darker. You should have. You're about to regret that decision. Micah's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain steady. The only one who's going to regret anything is you, Sheriff. Tillman stepped forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. Watch your mouth, Thompson. Micah squared his shoulders. No, I'm done watching. I'm done standing by while you abuse your position to protect yourself and keep people like me in line. I know you planted that evidence. I know you've been terrorizing this town for years. But that ends tonight. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel shifted uncomfortably at Tillman's side, and the young deputy behind the desk looked as though she wanted to disappear. Tillman chuckled under his breath, though the sound held no humor. You talk a big game, Thompson, but no one's going to believe a word you say. You're just another outsider with a chip on his shoulder. Not this time. Micah reached into his coat pocket, moving slowly so there would be no confusion. He pulled out his phone and held it up, showing the screen to Tillman. What's this? Tillman scoffed. Proof, Micah said simply. He tapped the screen, and a recording began to play, Colin's voice crackling over the speaker. Tillman told us to plan it, said we'd pin the bracelet on him, keep him out of town for good. I didn't think it'd go this far. I swear. The blood drained from Tillman's face. Daniels turned pale, his mouth falling open in shock. Micah watched the sheriff's composure unravel, piece by piece. You thought you could silence me. You thought you could erase me with a lie. But now, everyone is going to know exactly who you are. Tillman's hands balled into fists at his sides. You son of a... Before Tillman could finish, Micah's voice cut through like steel. You're finished, Sheriff. I'm sending this recording to the state police, to the press. Hell, I'll send it to every agency in the state if I have to. You can't hide this anymore. Tillman lunged forward, rage twisting his face. You think this changes anything? He roared, his voice echoing through the station. You think anyone's going to care what you have to say? This town is mine. Always has been. Micah didn't flinch. Not anymore. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Tillman's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling as the truth sank in. He had lost. The power he had wielded so ruthlessly was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Behind him, Daniels took a hesitant step back, clearly weighing whether he wanted to sink with Tillman or save himself. Sheriff, he said quietly, maybe we should. Shut up, Daniels. Tillman barked, whipping around. You think you're any better? You've been right there with me, every step of the way. Daniels paled, realizing that Tillman was throwing him under the bus to save himself. I didn't. Enough! Micah's voice thundered through the room, startling them both. This is over. You can keep pointing fingers all you want, but none of you are walking away from this. Tillman turned back to Micah, his eyes blazing with hatred. You don't know what you're doing, Thompson. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. Nothing. Funny, Micah said, stepping forward until they were just inches apart. That's what people like you always say right before they fall. Suddenly, the station door burst open, and Marcus strode in, flanked by two uniformed officers from the state police. Their expressions were stone cold as they took in the scene. Sheriff Tillman, one of them said, his voice authoritative, we've received multiple complaints about your conduct. You're under investigation for abuse of power, evidence tampering, and harassment. Tillman's face contorted with disbelief. You can't be serious. Marcus stepped up beside Micah, arms crossed. It's over, Sheriff. For a moment, Tillman looked like he might fight back, might lunge for his gun or make some desperate last stand. But as the state officers stepped forward, hands on their weapons, the fight drained from his body. Daniels, Tillman said hoarsely, turning to his deputy. Do something. Daniels took a step back, shaking his head. Sorry, Sheriff. You're on your own. Tillman's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Micah saw him for what he truly was, a small, broken man clinging to a power he no longer deserved. Take him, one of the officers said. Tillman didn't resist as they cuffed his hands behind his back and led him toward the door. As he passed Micah, he snarled, This isn't over. You'll see. People like you never win. Micah held his gaze, unflinching. I just did. Tillman was dragged outside, his shouts fading into the night. Daniel slunk off to his desk, avoiding everyone's eyes, and the younger deputy behind the desk let out a shaky breath. Marcus clapped Micah on the shoulder. You did it. Micah nodded, his chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment settled over him. He had won, but it didn't feel like victory just yet. Not while there were still people out there who believed the lies men like Tillman told. It's not over, Micah said quietly. There's still work to do. Marcus smiled faintly. Then let's get started. Micah turned and walked toward the door, stepping out into the cool night air. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't finished. It never was. The next morning, Micah stood outside the sheriff's station, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The building, once a fortress of unchecked power under Tillman's rule, felt different now. Its walls seemed smaller, its presence less imposing. For the first time in years, it wasn't an emblem of fear. A news van parked across the street, the buzzing of a camera crew breaking the silence. Reporters hovered around, microphones at the ready, waiting for any scraps of information. The word had spread fast. Sheriff Tillman arrested for corruption. Micah had made sure of it. Marcus appeared at Micah's side, holding 2 cups of coffee. He passed one to Micah, offering a quiet smile. "Thought you might need this." Micah took it gratefully, the warmth soothing his nerves. "Thanks. You okay?" Marcus asked, studying him. Micah inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. "I think so." The night before had been a blur. Tillman taken away in handcuffs, deputies scrambling to cover themselves, and the state police swooping in to gather statements and evidence. Daniels, cornered and shaken, had agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency, providing more than enough details to sink Tillman for good. It was over. At least this part of it. "I'll admit," Marcus said, breaking Micah's thoughts, "I didn't think we'd get here so fast. Tillman's been running this place like a fiefdom for years. But now, the whole house of cards is collapsing." Micah nodded, watching the reporters as they bustled around. "That's what happens when you push too far. People start to see the cracks." Marcus sipped his coffee, his tone turning more serious. "You know this doesn't stop with Tillman, right? There are others. People who let him get away with this for too long. Some of them are already scrambling to distance themselves." "I know," Micah said, his voice steady. "And I'm not done yet." Inside the station, later that day, Micah walked through the now-quiet sheriff's station, his steps measured and deliberate. Deputies who had once stared at him with disdain now avoided his gaze, their expressions unsure, some ashamed, others resentful. It didn't matter. The truth had exposed them all, whether they were active players or silent enablers. At the far end of the hallway, Micah entered a small conference room where 2 state police officers were reviewing files. Lieutenant Carla Hayes, a sharp and no-nonsense officer in her 40s, looked up as he entered. She gave him a nod of acknowledgement. "Mr. Thompson," she said, pulling a chair out for him, "you've stirred up quite a mess." "Sometimes a mess is what it takes to clean things up," Micah replied, sitting down. Hayes cracked a small smile, but her expression turned serious. "We've reviewed everything, the recording, the witness statements, and the forensic reports. Tillman and his deputies have been building their power off intimidation and corruption for years. It's going to take time to sort this all out, but I'll tell you this much. You did the right thing." "It shouldn't have taken this much," Micah said, his voice soft but weighted. "It shouldn't take risking your life just to be heard." Hayes sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You're right, but you forced their hand, and now the whole state is paying attention. It's not just Hayworth. Cases like this are everywhere. Maybe this will make someone else think twice before turning a blind eye." Micah considered her words. "What happens now?" "We've got Tillman," Hayes said firmly. "Daniels is cooperating, and we're gathering evidence against the others. The state's going to appoint a temporary sheriff to restore order here while the investigation continues." Micah exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Hayes leaned forward, studying him. "And what about you? What's next?" Micah hesitated, the question lingering in the air. For so long, his focus had been on exposing the truth, on holding men like Tillman accountable. But now that the storm was settling, he realized there was more work to be done. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally. "Hayworth deserves better, and I'm going to make sure it gets it." Hayes smiled faintly. "I figured you'd say that." Later that week, community meeting, the town hall was packed, more people than Micah had ever seen in one room. Families, students, shop owners, and elders filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity, relief, and simmering anger. A podium stood at the front of the room, where Micah now waited, the hum of conversation vibrating around him. Marcus stood nearby, offering a quiet nod of support as Micah stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. Micah adjusted the microphone, his heart pounding, but his voice steady when he spoke. "I don't think I need to tell anyone why we're here tonight," he began. "For too long, this town has been ruled by fear. Sheriff Tillman and his men didn't just abuse their power. They made us believe we couldn't stand up to them, that it was better to stay quiet, to stay small, to let them win." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. "I was told I didn't belong here," Micah continued. "That someone like me, an outsider, had no right to challenge the way things worked. But this isn't just about me. This is about every one of us who's ever been told to sit down, shut up, and accept injustice because it's easier than fighting back. Micah scanned the crowd, locking eyes with familiar faces. People he had seen at the diner, at the barbershop, on the street. But here's the truth, he said, his voice rising. Silence doesn't protect you. Silence gives men like Tillman power. The only way to change a broken system is to fight back, to stand together, and to demand better. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing louder. This fight isn't over, Micah continued as the applause faded. Removing one man doesn't fix the system that allowed him to thrive. It's going to take all of us holding each other accountable, watching, listening, speaking up, and I promise you this. As long as I'm here, I'll fight to make sure no one else has to go through what I did. The room erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, their cheers filling the space with a warmth Micah hadn't felt in weeks. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder as he stepped away from the podium. You nailed it, man. Micah smiled faintly, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and determination. It's a start, outside the town hall. As the meeting ended and people filed out into the cool night, a woman approached Micah. She was middle-aged with tired eyes and a small boy clinging to her hand. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice soft. I just wanted to say thank you. My brother, he had problems with Tillman years ago. He tried to speak up, but no one would listen. Micah nodded, his throat tightening. I'm sorry. She smiled faintly, glancing at her son. But you did something. You made them listen. That means something. It means everything, Micah said quietly. As the woman walked away, Marcus leaned against the railing beside him. You good? Micah looked out over the crowd, watching as families gathered, conversations sparked, and people finally felt safe enough to share their stories. I will be, Micah replied. One day. Marcus grinned. You're going to be a problem for a lot of people in power. You know that? Micah chuckled, shaking his head. Good. The two of them stood in silence, the weight of the evening settling over them. For Micah, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come because now the people of Hayworth knew they didn't have to be silent anymore. As he turned his face toward the moonlit sky, Micah allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over. But for tonight, it was enough. A month had passed since Sheriff Tillman's arrest, and the town of Hayworth was still adjusting to its new reality. For years, Tillman's shadow loomed over the streets, a quiet force that suppressed voices, dismissed struggles, and wielded power with an iron fist. That shadow was finally lifting, but the sunlight that streamed through exposed more than Micah Thompson had anticipated. Micah sat in his late father's workshop, the air rich with the scent of sawdust and oil. It was where he'd first learned to build, to take something raw, shape it with patience and determination, and turn it into something worthwhile. He couldn't help but feel that his own journey mirrored those same lessons. The events of the past weeks had changed him. He was still Micah Thompson, the quiet man who carried his father's legacy, but there was a new edge to him, a sharper resolve, an unshakable sense of purpose. He hadn't asked to become the center of a storm, but when the storm came, he stood tall, refusing to let it drown him. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the weight of his actions. The town after Tillman. Micah wasn't naive enough to believe that Tillman's arrest had fixed everything. He had seen the rot, deep and systemic, and he knew it wouldn't disappear overnight. People like Tillman didn't rise to power alone. There were others, those who had stood by silently, enabling the sheriff's corruption, and those who had benefited from the abuse while pretending not to see. But something had shifted. The community was awake now. People who had been too afraid to speak were beginning to find their voices. Stories were being shared. Tales of harassment, wrongful arrests, threats, and intimidation that stretched back decades. It was as though Micah's fight had turned a key, unlocking a flood of collective truth. The small diner on Main Street, where Micah had once felt like an outsider, had become a hub for change. At breakfast, he overheard conversations that felt new. People questioning the systems they had trusted for so long. People asking how they could do better, how they could move forward. It wasn't perfect. There were still whispers of resistance, of resentment from those clinging to the old ways. But progress had begun, and Micah knew it couldn't be undone. The newly appointed interim sheriff, a no-nonsense woman named Clara Maddox, was already holding meetings with the town council to review policies and procedures. Accountability was the word of the day. Micah attended every meeting he could, not because he wanted recognition, but because he refused to let Hayworth slide back into complacency. "Mr. Thompson," Sheriff Maddox said after one such meeting, stopping him at the door, "I hope you'll consider speaking more publicly on these issues. People listen to you." Micah paused, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "I'll speak when I need to, but I want people to understand this isn't about me. It's about all of us." She nodded in agreement. Change starts somewhere. Sometimes that somewhere is a person who refuses to stay silent. Micah's reflection. Late one afternoon, Micah sat on the porch of his family home, the sun dipping low in the sky, staining the horizon with streaks of orange and gold. Marcus sat beside him, nursing a glass of lemonade. They didn't say much at first, simply watching the day wind down. "Crazy how different things feel," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. "It's like there's hope again." Micah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Hope's a powerful thing." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. "You know, you didn't have to do all of this. You could have walked away after Tillman came for you. A lot of people would have." Micah looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "I thought about it more than once, but walking away would have meant letting them win. People like Tillman count on us to be too afraid to fight back. They survive because we stay silent." He took a sip of his drink, letting the words settle. "I couldn't let that happen. Not for me. Not for this town." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "You're stronger than you know, man." Micah didn't answer right away. He had thought about strength a lot lately, what it meant, where it came from. He realized that true strength didn't come from the ability to fight back. It came from knowing when to fight, when to stand still, and when to let your actions speak for themselves. "People keep calling me brave," Micah said quietly, more to himself than to Marcus. "But bravery isn't what got me through this. It was knowing I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing." He looked back at Marcus, his voice steady. "It wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about proving that no one gets to take away your dignity. Not for who you are, where you come from, or what you look like." Marcus smiled faintly. "You did more than prove it. You showed this whole town what it means to stand up when it matters." The larger picture. The news of Tillman's arrest spread far beyond Hayworth. Local media picked up the story first, then regional outlets. Soon, it was being discussed on national platforms. Another example of systemic corruption brought to light by one person's refusal to stay silent. For Micah, the attention wasn't something he sought, but he couldn't deny its importance. People were paying attention now, asking questions, demanding answers, and holding their local leaders accountable. Hayworth was just one town, but its story had become a rallying cry for others. The video recording of Colin's confession, which Micah had made public, sparked conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and courtrooms across the country. "How did this happen?" people asked. "Why didn't anyone stop it sooner?" It was a harsh reality to confront, but Micah believed the questions were necessary. Nothing changes until people face the truth. Moving forward, in the weeks that followed, Micah found himself stepping into a new role, one he hadn't anticipated. Community leaders reached out to him, asking for his insights and input. Students from nearby schools asked him to speak about what he'd experienced and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. He never saw himself as a leader, but maybe that was why people listened. He was just a man who had refused to accept what was broken. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Marcus asked one evening as they walked through town. Micah shook his head. "Not anymore. I used to think the only way to survive was to get out. Now I see that staying and fighting is how you make things better." Marcus grinned. "You're a stubborn man, Micah Thompson." Micah chuckled softly. "Yeah, and I'm not done yet." A call to action. In the end, Micah's story wasn't just about him. It was about resilience, about justice, and about the power of one voice refusing to be silenced. It was about a town learning that change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from standing up, speaking out, and holding those in power accountable. It wasn't a perfect ending, because life didn't work that way. But it was progress. As Micah sat on his porch that evening, the town quiet around him, he thought about the road ahead. The fight for justice was ongoing. Always would be. But now he knew he wasn't alone. To anyone listening, to anyone watching his story unfold, Micah had one message. Change is possible, but it starts with you. When the world tells you to be silent, speak. When the odds feel impossible, stand tall. Because sometimes one voice is all it takes to change everything.